Welcome back to Vivid Noise. As it's more than evident from my choice in games, I'm a pretty big fan of racers, be it arcade or a little on the realistic side. In this case, we're looking at a racer that could be a little bit of both, depending on your preference. This is MotoGP, released for the PS2 in October of 2000 by Namco, and while I mainly want to talk about this particular title, I'm also going to address British team Climax's take on the exact same concept released 2 years later. In fact, the coexistence of these two versions of what is essentially the same game is the reason I'm talking about MotoGP to begin with. Dev teams being switched around is nothing new, but in this case, the two versions of the same game were being released side by side by different publishers no less. That's what intrigues me here. Anyway, let's focus on Namco's version for now. Being much more familiar with 4 wheels as opposed to 2, there was definitely a bit of an adjustment period at first. It took me a good few laps to really get it in my head that bikes handle in a fundamentally different way compared to cars. The racing in MotoGP is all about anticipation. By the time you're entering a corner, you need to have your next few maneuvers already mapped out. Fortunately for me, Namco's driving model is nowhere near as punishing as what the physics of the real sport would imply. While you're still going to have to learn the tracks and adapt to your bike's handling characteristics, the arcade roots of this game can unmistakably be felt. Yeah, I guess I should mention that MotoGP is a successor to the arcade racer called 500GP, and with that in mind, you can expect to get a feel for the handling pretty quickly. Whether or not this game is realistic was never the point to me. All I'm here for is an engaging racing experience, and I was very pleasantly surprised with this. You'd be shocked just how fresh all of these familiar tracks feel now that I'm tackling them in such a different way. Honestly, the fun factor and nuance of the riding in this game might just be enough to make up for the limited selection of tracks. Unlike contemporaries on last gen like Porsche Unleashed or Colin McRae Rally 2.0, MotoGP only has 5 tracks, although they are licensed for what that's worth. To cut the game some slack, racing games are niche as it is, and bike racers are even more so expecting AAA levels of content would be a little bit unreasonable. Not to mention that the smaller size of the bikes compared to cars does make these tracks feel a lot more substantial. It feels almost surreal having so much more room on the road, and with that, more riders going around the same parts of the track at once. There's a certain viscera and excitement to this form of racing that I don't usually get from a conventional racing game. And maybe this is just placebo, but I swear each lap takes longer to complete than normal here, which simply amplifies the sense of scale these tracks really should have. This might be the first time I've felt like these tracks I've explored in countless other games actually felt as big as they would realistically be if you were to visit them. Seriously, going back to Gran Turismo or something makes these places feel like miniature sets. I think this whole scale thing taps into my love of games like Revolt, RC Cars, or Hot Wheels Beat That. You know, the ones where you control a vehicle that's quite small and so the world around you feels huge. I think there's something like that going on here, and it really goes a long way in giving each track a character that I'd never really felt before. If anything, it at least makes the measly 5 tracks less of a drawback than it would normally be. I mean, imagine a Forza with only 5 tracks. That's the on-track action covered, but what about the career mode? This game was made around that time when racing games were overhauling their single-player modes after all. Well, it's really nothing too in-depth, but it works for the kind of game that this is, I feel. You get to pick between a bunch of teams, each with their own bike stats, drivers, and placement requirements. Although, even the highest ranking one only requires you to get 6th place, which, thanks to the forgiving physics, won't take you too many attempts. Once you complete a season with a chosen team, you get to either keep progressing with the same one or pick a new one. Personally, I would have liked it a little more if you had to commit to whichever team you initially chose, since I feel like that would make the game at least a little bit more immersive. Although on the other hand, I guess if you really didn't like the provided bikes or even team colors, I guess, it's nice to have the option to switch. In terms of long-term progression, you've got these little cards you can earn with pictures of the team members. It's a small addition, but I feel like it adds a bit of charm to what would otherwise be a very cold and unwelcoming sport. At the start of the video, I said that this game could appeal to both the arcade mindset and a more sim-oriented player. If you couldn't tell by the footage, I didn't have this feature on while recording, but much like Need for Speed 2 and Free on PS1, you can enable a simulation mode. It's exactly what it says in the tin. Your bikes become a lot heavier, cornering generally becomes less forgiving, and you are actually able to fall off your bike under the right circumstances. I don't usually care for such a setting in what would typically be considered an arcade racer, but in this case, I think the addition was justified. Unlike some other games from around the same time where simulation just means you can't turn, the fundamental differences in how MotoGP handles compared to a four-wheel racer allows this mode to completely change the experience. Turning simulation mode on doesn't simply result in a few stat tweaks. You have to adapt to the newfound weight of your bike, and you can forget about being competitive if you don't already know the tracks inside and out. It's a real challenge, and while it's not what I'm personally looking for in a racing game, the inclusion is most certainly appreciated. Even better than simulation mode itself is the way that it's implemented. MotoGP treats this alternate handling model as pure player preference, and unlike a lot of newer racing games which adjust your earnings depending on your level of driving aids or AI difficulty, for example, here, simulation mode is simply a selection you make when starting a career. That's it. In fact, that's how Need for Speed handled its driving settings too, although again, I don't really see the point in using the simulation mode in Need for Speed Free, for example, since the tracks don't really feel like they're built for it. Lastly, before we take a look at the Western developed MotoGP, I should seriously praise Namco's presentation and production values. Emulation up-resing aside, this game looks really good for a late Y2K release on the PS2. The colors are nice and natural, the animation is smooth and believable, and the attention to detail is remarkable. Just look at how defined those shadows look compared to a lot of other PS2 games with black smudges under their models. And they even bothered to give the only racer in this game with long hair a unique head model with animated hair. Oh, and by the way, this year 2000 console release runs at 60 FPS and has legit widescreen support. It doesn't even stretch the hood. Notice how my speedometer is a perfect circle. Also, the background music is some more of that peak late 90s drum and bass, so that's a pretty big W right there. It's pretty clear that I really love what Namco have done with this game, but unlike today, when the MotoGP brand is handled exclusively by Milestone SRL, Namco were not the only ones making a game using this license. Developed by Climax and published by THQ, MotoGP Ultimate Racing Technology was released for PC and Xbox in 2002, although it was also on the GBA and the N-Gage, can't forget that. To get the obvious out of the way, URT, as I'm gonna call it, looks much better. Big surprise. Although, funnily enough, it doesn't support widescreen on PC, even by 2005 with the third entry. Other than that though, the textures look so real, it's like you could freaking lick the road. And when it rains, you get these nice reflections and particles all over the screen. Even the original 2002 release looks great for its time and holds up better than a lot of other bigger budget games. The music, on the other hand, just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't even know what genre to put it in. There's just these bass lines and weird textures, but it doesn't sound like a finished track. The second game in the URT trilogy does have some chunky nu metal riffs though, so at least it has something to listen to. As for the driving, well, unlike with Namco's game where you could choose between a more simplified or nuanced driving model, Climax just gives you one option and it's somewhere in between the two driving modes Namco gives you. You're still quite likely to fall off your bike, but your opponents are just as susceptible to it. The bikes also have a more pronounced grip threshold when cornering and braking. Crashes also create more of a spectacle with the music stopping, the camera going all shaky, and your rider flopping all over the dirt. It's interesting how Climax's take on MotoGP is at the same time more arcade in its presentation, yet the driving leans, no pun intended, more on realism, if ever so slightly. Adding to the arcade feel are some fictional tracks added in the third installment, like you have to drive through Tokyo with some mid-2000s EDM in the background, although nothing could replace some authentic jungle from the appropriate time period. The single player is also a little different. Every time you complete a race, you're given some points you can use to upgrade your stats, like you're playing Tony Hawk or something. Honestly, I never noticed a big difference between before or after having my stats increased, but maybe I just have to put some more hours in. Overall, Climax's efforts are quite good in their own right, although they definitely appeal to a different audience compared to Namco's original offerings. I've made my own preference pretty clear, but I think both studios' games are worth looking at if you're into this sort of thing. I mainly wanted to talk about these games because of just how odd it feels to me seeing the same license handled by different people at the same time. Imagine if Turn 10 got their hands on the F1 license and started making F1 games side by side with Codemasters, and I don't even mean as like a support studio, I'm talking about competition between publishers too, so in this case, EA versus Microsoft. Honestly, if there's anything of the sort going on right now, now, feel free to let me know in the comments because I'd love to hear about it. So yeah, that pretty much wraps up a look at these two very similar but also quite different games. I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Vivid Noise, and I'll see you guys next time.